Welcome to the BEZA Performance Podcast. We introduce executive disciplines and organizational disciplines for organizations that want to be world class. And so today we're talking about the one thing that motivates all people. And welcome, Randall Weidenauer, my guest today.
Thank you, Marshall. Thanks for having me on your podcast.
Good to see you. Randall and I have worked together for quite a while now. Randall's the president of VP Culture and is also a BEZA associate. So we partner quite a bit. And I'm kind of excited today, Randall, to talk about the one thing that motivates all people. It's a bit of a catchy hook, but I think it would be helpful if you could get into before we answer the question, would you mind doing some brain science for us to kind of explain where all this is coming from?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
Let's talk a little bit about the brain science behind motivation. And when you get into the gurus on the internet and what's going on in that sphere today, everybody's talking about dopamine, and dopamine is the one thing that motivates all people, according to the internet gurus. But you'll find that dopamine is this double-edged sword. The more you use it, the worse it gets. So you'll notice that everyone is pursuing dopamine, and it's the molecule in our brain that causes us to pursue things. And so there's a gentleman that wrote a book called The Hacking of the American Mind. And this doctor was saying that we're actually using this tool to hack our minds into motivational situations. So marketers are using it. You know, our devices are all hacked so that every single thing is novelty and giving us another zap of dopamine to motivate us to keep going on that app or keep going onto the next thing. Our entertainment is hacked that way. Our food is hacked that way, down to the precise chemicals so that we can't stop eating. So everything is sort of geared towards us watching that next show, watching that next thing. And, even the plots are unresolved and trying to get us to see what's going on next. So what it does, though, is it really hacks the brain, and it works. So it's not something that's like, oh, this is just crazy. It works, and it works quickly on the human brain. However, here's the key, and the research scientists have found that what dopamine does is it downregulates, so that each time you get a hit of dopamine, it's going to require twice the dopamine to get to you the same place the next time. Gotcha. So if you as a leadership team go, hey, this will motivate our people, and you offer sort of a dopaminergic reward, it's going to require twice as much the next time, and twice as much the next time, and twice as much the next time. And eventually you just can't supply that amount. So what do people do? They get bored, because it's like, you're never going to meet our dopamine. And you've programmed us already that everything has to be dopaminergic. So when you stop that juice, the gas pedal comes up, and the human being gets unmotivated quickly. And that's Randall, the numbers that we see across the board.
So Randall, what are examples of what we do traditionally, going back to the 50s even, in terms of the early science of management that are dopaminergic, to use the word?
Dopaminergic, yeah. So
I love that word.
Yeah, it's kind of a cool word. Very scientific. It makes us sound really smart. Dopaminergic are like the goals and rewards and your classic operant conditioning that came in at the same time as the science of management. So they were looking at behavioralistic models, because it was very like, we're not going to look at the inside of a person. We just want to care what they do. And if we can get them to jump through a hoop, let's do that. And so it's like your financial rewards, your systems that are set up for recognition, and all of those things, and you think, oh, but I've seen that worked. I've pursued those things. Yes, it does work. Don't get me wrong. Okay, so that's the thing that tricks a lot of leaders. It's like, look, we got people to jump through the hoop that we wanted them to, and they did. However, on the long-term aggregate, like I said, it serves as a downward spiral.
Okay. Well, so we'll get to that later, because we are going to talk about how this idea is a bit disruptive in terms of how most people think that people are motivated. And so hang on, if you're skeptical because of that, I get it. All I work with is executives who are skeptical about this kind of stuff. But this is brain science. So let's talk about the other side of the equation, the one thing that we're going to get to eventually that is, in fact, driving this biologically from a motivator standpoint.
So, yeah, that's a little bit deeper, and it's a little bit, it's a little bit different pathway to obtain it. And so what we're talking about here is serotonin. It's you
Okay.
don't see the like when you go on the podcast, you don't like today we're going to talk about serotonin and this is what motivates people. And serotonin is the thing that engages when we feel connected to others, okay?
Okay.
And what that does is that starts to give us a sense of contentment and peace and scientists like Dr. Hart call this the master modulator, meaning it's a brain molecule like dopamine, but it's more powerful. To use the kind of the Lord of the Rings analogy, it's the one ring that rules them all. So it goes in and it actually affects everything that's subordinate to it. So dopamine is going to be subordinate to it, and all the other chemicals that are modulating your brain and your body system by extension are modulated by serotonin. So it's the master modulator. And when this engages, we actually feel content and happy and engaged with life. And it starts to upregulate all of the human systems of thriving. Your pain goes down, your pleasure goes up, your tolerance of difficulties goes in, your endurance extends. So all the human optimization levels of thriving are controlled by this. And we could geek out more on it, but that's the big picture
Okay.
of what's going on in our brains that's starting to motivate us and draw us in as human beings.
So it's not simplistic like dopamine bad, serotonin good. It's both are
Exactly.
going to be present in any environment. But the idea is that most of us have learned management techniques that are really designed to tap into more of a dopamine kind of thing than serotonin. So let's do
Yeah.
this. We talked about the science a bit. Let's answer the question: what is the one thing that motivates all people?
So the one thing that motivates all people is that sense of feeling valued by
Okay.
others. Okay, when you enter into a space and you go like, look at all these people around me value me, then the human being goes into a thrive state. So we have a sort of a mutual mind state with other people, our families, our coworkers, the people in our community. When we look at them and say, I feel valued by them, then we start to the brain starts to secrete that serotonin that says you're safe, you're in good place, you're going to feel good, you're going to thrive, go forward in life. And so
And if
that's
I
the
understood,
precondition that scientists find that releases that dopamine surge that motivates us.
so if I understood what you said earlier, then if something bad does happen, even you're less likely to be toppled off your seat emotionally
Yeah,
by your,
it,
your
it,
your
it
contentness.
increases that what psychologists call resilience.
Okay.
That you've heard that book about grit. This is what, because it's a master modulator, it downregulates pain and upregulates resilience so that people have more endurance and more stick-to-itiveness than they would without that serotonergic state.
Okay.
Dopamine might motivate you quickly to jump and grab something, but serotonin is going to give you the long haul motivation in life to keep going. And here's a good example. Harvard did a longevity study, and they studied subjects from their 20s all the way up into their 80s. And it was this state of being surrounded by people that cared for them and valued them that made all points of human thriving tick off for these people. Like they were more resilient, they had better careers, they had more finance, they had better health, their families were better. On all points of resilience and thriving, they who had that precondition of being valued by others around them, healthy relationships, they thrived more than their cohort who didn't have that, who pursued other things and weren't surrounded by being valued.
So do we have practices that can be taught and measured? I mean, because BEZA does disciplines, things that can be taught and measured, and you can be successful at or get better at. Do we have that for this sort of approach that views serotonin and valuing people as an optimal state?
Yeah, definitely. So that's one of the things in my scientific endeavors of approaching this, creating culture on scientific foundation. So I set up that as I align your culture on that one thing that motivates people. And then there are three key pathways, sciences that I use to align your managers and your leaders that can be taught in a didactic way.
Okay.
And they could learn the sciences so that they could become those leaders that people go, boy, that leader just had it, and they're the ones that connected with me and motivated me in my life.
So would it be fair to say that, we've all had that great leader in our lives that we felt was, maybe the best person we've ever worked
Yeah.
for or the most motivating? Would it be that those people were sort of instinctively or naturally, let's just say, doing these kinds of things that you would be teaching people to do using the three sciences.
Yeah, of course, and
Okay,
and every leader and every organization is on the spectrum of this and may naturally have a
sure.
lot of these things, just by the sense that maybe they were brought up in a place where they felt valued, and there's a whole attachment science behind that. If you have that, you're naturally going to be able to do that more naturally with people.
Right.
However, we're taking this a little bit more further, and we're trying to ascertain what are the key elements in
Okay.
creating those relationships that cause that kind of group sensation to happen, and for everyone to start feeling valued. And there's some research by Gallup and by a lot of other social scientists that point to some key elements that need to be inculcated into your leaders that aren't being taught as foundational in business school.
Well, obviously, it would take more than the time allowed to get into all of that. But could you outline for us? Give us an idea what those three sciences
Sure,
are.
sure. And they kind of, so the individual wants to feel valued. So what are the key things that are going to do that? So you're going to engage with that person's past, and the research is overwhelming by Gallup that says that if you engage with their past, which leads you to their strengths, like if you take 5-factor personality tests and you lead that person to who they really are, then that person will fundamentally feel like you're leading them to their strengths and not to like what you're not. Because this 5-factor personality test will give your leaders the insight into each individual and say, I know exactly what you're made of, and let me lead you exactly to who your best self is. And so imagine how that would make you feel valued instead of your leader going, you're no good at this. You're no good at this. And eventually that just makes people shrivel. So it's that vision of the leader to see this is who you are and this is how you need to be aligned in the workplace. And then the person just feels wonderful. So that's one. The second one is an emotional engagement. So what I say is emotions is like the primary language that we learn as human beings. And when we're not speaking it to each other with candor and with accuracy, there's another scientific practice we call ACT that helps us to do this, not in a reactive way, like, oh, let's all be super emotional. It's like, no, let's just properly identify our emotions and be able to connect with each other functionally so that we can pivot towards our values. And that's what the third science is value science, is really being able to lead an organization, each individual down a pathway that they can articulate what their highest values are. And there's 3 different tiers of values that that we get from Viktor Frankl and his work in helping us as human beings to really set our future orientation towards a place that will create value for us. And it's called like a values landscape. So like when I feel like I'm heading in the direction that I've already chose, and I schedule my life and the activities that I do towards that path, values cannot be thwarted. So that when people show up at work, you could have a catastrophe in your plant, a key piece of machinery goes out, but your KPIs might be off, but what are your managers going to do? What are their core values? What's going to drive them to do something that will align with their values? And they can't be
Okay.
thwarted when they're working like that. So that's what drives people in the future. So
So we've got clear, fairly well-established brain science that would say the kind of the way a lot of us were taught to manage. It was kind of based in the 50s and 60s science of behavioralism. That's suboptimal. That it works, it just doesn't work as well.
correct.
So that we need to create a culture that values people, which I think everybody would vote for, right? I don't have anybody I work with that thinks that's hoo-ha. So that isn't disruptive. And then the
Yeah.
fact that you've got systematic approaches to transfer some skill set to all management, to first line all the way to the executive, to be better at this stuff and to really
Sure.
tap into that serotonergic brain function. But I think we should talk about disruption at this point, because one of the things you and
Okay.
I've privately talked about is, there's a lot of people listening to this that are saying, but I've got to have financial performance. And
Sure.
that's got to be at least equal to this, right? I can say I value people, but if we don't make any money around here, I don't have a job to manage. I mean, to value people with. I mean, and if I own the business, I can't employ the people to value them if we don't make money. So this is where I think it would help for you to sort that out a bit. And if our viewers can kind of buckle in, that would be great.
Sure.
Let's talk about
Sure.
that.
Yeah, the disruptive nature of this is like this, and So oftentimes people look at two pathways and they think, well, I've got this financial pathway, and then I've got this, yeah, sure, I'll value people while I'm at it, And so when you lead your organization and you're saying, hey, we're going towards this financial pathway, sure, along the way we might value people. What actually happens when we do the scientific and we do the business studies is that that orientation towards finance actually starts to cause the finance to diminish. And here's the interesting point. It's the counterintuitive point that when we put valuing people first, that the financial aspect follows in lockstep after it. Okay? So that's the radical kind of disruptive thing. Is like if you want to pursue finances, you will lose it. If you pursue valuing people first, you will actually optimize your business to gain more in the financial realm. It's just like that longevity study where we showed when you have that optimal state of human thriving, then the other categories will upregulate as well. So that's kind of the
So,
disruptive thought.
well, I don't think it's that disruptive though yet. I want to really dig into what I think is. I don't know if you've conveyed it at the level of disruptiveness that you're
Okay.
really proposing, and that is that it's not just a means to an end. You're not saying that a
Correct.
great way to get financial performance, which is the main thing we want, is to use these methodologies. You're actually saying, and this is the disruptive part, as I hear it, that financial performance is a lagging indicator of doing these things, and ultimately your
Yep.
highest value must be valuing people. And this is where I
Correct.
lose a lot of folks because they spend their days with financial performance as a primary way they think about the business. Now, great leaders are always worried about people, but are concerned about people's being well led and well managed. So I don't have anybody I work with that I wouldn't consider a great leader. But this idea that it's primary as a value, I think we got to unpack that a bit for folks.
Sure. Sure. That is the disruptive part of it.
It's above goals and it's above financial outcomes, but it's not. But it's synergistic with them, I guess.
Correct. That's
So
the key understanding of that. You have the synergy between finance and valuing people that is very tightly connected. But it's interesting. It's like killing the golden goose. We were talking about
right,
that Aesop's fable. It's sort of like short-term games. If I want to get everything that I can out of these employees, you can pressure them and devalue them and get some optimal output, but then you're left with that one egg instead of a long-term process. If we want to, we can get into how that sometimes happens with some sort of robber baron private equity firms that go in and they
yeah,
dismantle the culture. They put pressure on the employees so that they start to leave and retire quickly, so that the balance sheet shows all of this profitability when they reduce the finances, but they're left with this like shattered culture of a shell of a culture.
yeah,
They sell it for a great profit. The bottom line looks great. They walk away with bank, but you've just dismantled a culture.
yeah.
And so that's a good example of like, sure, on paper this company looks great, but you've just demotivated. You've sort of ripped out the operating system of humanity that is running the business, and now you've left with a shell that's not going to be functional long term. So
So the operating, I like that term. The operating system of humanity is the serotonin. So the serotonin cycle, or I'm not familiar with the science as you are,
yeah,
in your brain, it upregulates everything. It decreases fear. I think everybody who's listening could say, yeah, if I had employees that told me they honestly told me they love their job and they can't wait to get to work and they love the people they work with, like that would be a good thing, and it probably would affect financial output.
exactly.
So, do we have any evidence that that sort of impact, brain function wise, actually translates to the, as you would call them, lagging indicators of the organization? Important. It's not that we throw them away; they're just lagging indicators behind this other thing that we're focusing our
Yeah,
value system on.
definitely. So a
What are
great
the?
way to test that is to look at actual case studies, business case studies, and I
Mhm.
like to point to Southwest Airlines, who's had this philosophy
Certainly.
for a long time. They were kind of like, forerunners of this philosophy. Herb Kelleher, who started Southwest Airlines, always had this like people first kind of mentality of valuing people first in his culture, and he's just known for the culture that he created in Southwest Airlines. And it's also a great picture because they're not like this unicorn industry like Tesla, who's just so far ahead of the technology that people are all playing catch up now. They they entered into a mature industry 60 years ago, and that industry has such a tight margin of financial success that most industries, as an industry, they've posted a net loss in 50 years. So it's a very tight industry. But in that 60 years, they as an organization have thrived, like I've said, with that primary philosophy of valuing people first. They have the highest output, the highest productivity. They're one of the largest airlines in the world today. Most airports that you go to has a whole terminal just for Southwest. Okay, that's because they so dominate the market that through this philosophy. And like you and I were, what does that practically look like? Well, there's stories in Southwest Airlines where when they pull up to the gate and they're 10 minutes late, the pilot, these are all unionized groups, so that there's a pilot's union, there's a baggage union. The pilot will actually get out of his seat, go down and go into the cargo hold, and instead of saying, "Oh, it was the air traffic controllers that made us late," and we're not going to make our numbers, he gets down into the cargo hold and starts shucking bags with the other guys, and the gates agents start working faster and doing what they can to make up the time. And that's been the secret of Southwest Airlines, that everyone is engaged and feeling valued and valuing their teammates. And there's just story after story that's like that makes a difference on the ground level where productivity starts to increase because that serotonergic happening in the inside has changed, has shifted those individuals into every moment of their working life, instead of like what Gallup calls disengaged employees, which actually downrank. The operating system says it's not worth living. We're not being valued. So they sort of slow down. They physically slow down. They mentally slow down. They become less creative individuals. And as employees, they just don't produce as much.
So we'll get into employee engagement in a bit because I know there's some studies that have been done on that. I like what we've spoken about because I've met the gentleman because I'm based in St. Louis. We do business internationally, but because I'm based in St. Louis and had a brief stint interacting with his company, I've met Bob Chapman, and that's a guy that's put his money where his mouth is. Like this is
for sure
every bit part of his thinking. So why don't you talk about Bob a little bit?
Yeah, Bob has written a book called Everybody Matters, and their whole philosophy since the 70s has been putting people first. He had he inherited as his business, but it was on its last legs when he got it. And then they injected this radical idea as sort of a last ditch method for turning companies around, first starting with theirs and with all the other acquisitions that they've done over the years. They go into companies, they don't fire people, they employ their techniques of valuing people, and they've had tremendous financial success by pursuing this people first mentality. So they're a great example at Barry Wehmiller and they're not a knowledge-based client. Mostly, they usually purchase manufacturing organizations, and so it's not just thinking groups, but it's actually hardworking line workers and managers of that nature that can pull this off and can work in this kind of manner and create these kind of cultures that cause businesses to thrive. So they go into businesses that are kind of failing and they turn them around and upregulate that operating system of humanity, because it's the people that run organizations and give life to them.
So Gallup, I know, did some studies. Why don't we get into that, because that actually indicates some actual return on these kinds of efforts.
Sure. A lot of your people might be familiar with Gallup's study using the Q12 survey, trying to.
Big fan.
Yeah, they tried to quantify employee engagement, and then they've also done tremendous work because they have such a high rate of survey that they have a high statistical value of their outcomes, and they show things like 22% greater profitability, 20% greater productivity. I think it's like 37% lower turnover. And then there's been other groups that have studied, like, so what is their overall stock value? Generally, organizations that have engaged employees have 11% higher stock value than their competitors. So, like I said, this starts to translate into that financial outcomes that follow this valuing people proposition. So that's why it's so exciting for us to see this sort of disruptive idea come into management and practice of building cultures.
So if I were to take what you've said so far and re-summarize, there's some solid brain science that's established that uh, this serotonergic cycle in our brain, when it's activated, actually provides huge benefits for our functioning. We become
Yep.
optimal, and that those states can be achieved by well-run businesses through leadership practices that
Correct.
are
Yeah.
teachable and measurable.
Uh-huh.
But the hard part is if you really want an optimal culture, you're going to have to put valuing people and whatever that means. It's a pretty complex picture of what that looks like, because it also means
Sure.
valuing your customers, valuing the people that are your your stockholders and other stakeholders. But
Correct.
valuing people has to be in front of everything else, and that's
Correct.
the disruption. Most people aren't willing to take that step, but if they
Yeah.
do, they're going to get everything else. That's what I'm
Yeah.
hearing.
And the other point that Gallup made was very interesting because the people that you serve are
Hmm.
actually part of the picture. They're like the community that you're
Sure.
working with. You're engaging with them. You're not working just in isolation from them. And when employees are engaged, Gallup's research shows that your consumers become engaged, and they will have a 23% greater share of wallet, those organizations that have that symbiosis between consumer and engaged employees, because
Hmm.
there's something that crosses that barrier that people say, hey, I feel valued by this organization. And then they become fans of the organization. We all have brands that we go like, oh, you got to go to this
Hmm.
place. You got to, and we actually, word of mouth, just can't say enough great things about certain organizations. And you'll be that organization in your city that everybody says, oh, that place has a great culture. You got to go work there. Everyone loves working there. And so that
So,
draws in employees, and it even draws in clients. So that 23% greater share of wallet is a result of this whole energy that's created by the operating system of being valued as a human being. It reciprocates even into the consumer world.
well, so you've used the word culture several times, and so developing this culture, which is where we value people as our
Hmm.
primary value. Um, let's define that. What is culture?
Yeah, we've used the word human operating system several
Yeah.
times, and that's what I like to call it. It's the human operating system because we can kind of conceptualize of that. It's like the thing that
Okay.
that is kind of like the human operating system that we put in an entire group. There's a functionality. We've all been on different kinds of like athletic teams and different places that we've worked, and there's just something different about the way the group functions, and that's the culture. And that operating system is essential because all the programs, the processes that we study in business school run on top of that operating system.
Hmm.
And when you've got a failed operating system that's glitchy, people can't get along on any human level, then every single process that you try to change and grow with is going to be staticky and ultimately lead to failure. And that's borne out again and again in cultural research and in business case studies as well.
Okay. So I guess if we were to kind of wrap up our thinking for this podcast, I'll have you back. We can unpack a few things a little bit more in the
Sure.
future. But the idea of having a culture where value people being valued in its biggest sense is the main objective of the organization that leads to all other objectives. All the other objectives are important. That
Correct.
is essentially a cultural question, and that culture can be done. So culture can be executed. Culture can be focused on this one thing that motivates all people.
Yeah.
I'm sure we still have some skeptics who are, thinking this is still all foo-foo and, who cares about the brain science? Maybe we do. But if there's some
Yeah.
mild skeptics, people that are certainly interested, as I was originally, and now I am very much so, what would you say to those folks that are just kind of wondering how would I even,
Yeah, I mean, I
start?
often I often challenge leaders to like think of your organization. If we just extracted all of the people from your organization, how long would
Yeah.
it last? Well, we've got a few automated systems that would keep ticking for about a week, and then it would just cease. So you have to really look, what is the foundational element of your organization, and it's the people. So if you're going to, and the foundational element of those people interrelating to each other is the culture. So having that culture that is a VP culture is what I call it, a valuing people culture. You've
Yes.
got something that you can build a rock solid organization on, and then your processes and everything else start to have structure and foundation, and you can build a powerful building on top of that. Whereas
Okay.
if you've got somebody who's got, like, this is what they're starting off on, and then they're trying to build stuff on top of that slanted, distorted culture that has like pitfalls on it over here, you're going to have chaos and disrupted. It's going to be broken, and your outcomes are going to be very poor. And that's borne out again, like I said, in case studies in the business realm. So it's that foundation that we're looking for, that operating system that we're looking for. And like, of course, in every building, that's going to be the most critical element of the entire structure.
Okay. I think for our next time we have you on the podcast, let's talk more about what does it look like when this gets deployed. I mean, what are the who are the people we're valuing, and what does that look like
Sure.
exactly, and what are those spheres? And then we talked about the three sciences: personality science, emotional science, and value science. I'd like to talk about those some more
Yeah,
and
there's
unpack
lots to
that as
unpack
well.
there.
Yeah. So, well, I really appreciate you being on with us today, Randall.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was a great time.
Yep, I'm sure we'll get some Q&A out of this. And if you have any questions, if you are late and you weren't able to see this live, then on YouTube you can just put some stuff in the comments, and we'll make sure to answer your questions. So thanks a bunch.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Have a great
Have a great
afternoon,
day.
Marshall.
You too.